My name is Mark Angelucci. I'm a practicing attorney in Los Angeles. Right now I practice workers' compensation, but I've also done family law. I've done 10 years of civil litigation and other areas. I did work on Skid Row doing poverty law, and I've done mental health law as well. Just my background, I grew up in Eagle Rock. I went to Pasadena City College, spent way too much time there, and then transferred to UC Berkeley. My major was philosophy, and then I went to UCLA Law, and that was way back in the year 2000 that I graduated. So I've been doing various areas of law since then. But some of the things I've been doing have to do with male victims of domestic violence, and that's why I'm here. And I remember a time back then in around 1998, 2000, when people who talked about these issues had to really hide in the dark to do it, unless you were just giving token recognition of male victims. You really didn't talk about it much, or you were seen as somebody who was trying to backlash. You got all kinds of reactions. People laugh. People would call the men wimps, or whatever it might have been. But what I'm going to talk about today, I'm not an expert on the statistics like Martin Fiebert is, who's speaking across the way. I'm not a psychologist, but what I have done is things relating to the law, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. And I'm going to start by talking a little bit about how I got into all this on a personal level, what brought me into these issues. And then I'm going to go a little bit into the statistics, but not a lot, because that just isn't my area. And then I'm going to go into the lawsuit called Woods versus Horton, which is the lawsuit that I filed against the state on behalf of battered men. And I'm going to talk about what happened and the decision. And after that, I'm going to talk a little bit about the aftermath, where we are now, how is it being enforced, what needs are there still, and that sort of thing. If anyone has any questions, I'm happy to answer. So you can raise your hand really at any time. I might tell you that I'm going to get to that, but feel free, please, to ask anything you want. When I was a student at UCLA Law, and this was around 1997, 98, I have a best friend who is married. He's Irish, and he drinks a lot, and so does she. And they drink way too much, and they're always drunk. But the alcohol affects them differently. So he becomes a guy who sings songs and becomes happy, like a happy drunk, and then falls asleep. And something in her triggers something. It triggers something in her that can be very violent. It's not always, but I've seen it. And she'll start breaking things, kicking him, hitting him. I've seen her break glass and throw it at him. I've seen her break glass and try to slit her wrist. And when I tried to talk her out of it, she punched me. That was one of the times that I was there and saw it happening. Most of the time, I wasn't there. The problem was when he's been drinking too, he can't drive out of there. And they had kids, little kids. And growing up in a situation that wasn't physical but verbally violent, I know the effect it has on the kids, probably physical even more. And they called me Uncle Mark. So I had a concern. And also he would come to me, he would call me and ask me to get him out of the house. He would call her parents to take the kids and then call me to get him out. And I was a law student and I was busy. And after a while I couldn't keep doing that. So I started calling around, asking places if there was any place that would help him. There's shelters. I'd call the hotline. I called, all over LA. And that's when I found I got the same answer everywhere. Varied a little bit, but pretty much the same. He's a male victim. Now they would ask, what's her name? And I would explain, he's a male. And they would say, we don't have anything for him. We only serve women. Some of them would tell me that there is a place way out in the desert in Lancaster. How many of you know where Lancaster is? Lancaster? Okay, a lot of you. Good. Well, you know it because of Magic Mountain being near there, probably. But Lancaster is a remote desert community And there is a shelter out there called Valley Oasis. It's also known as the Antelope Valley Domestic Violence Council. And what I learned after making a lot of calls, by the time I learned about that place, and by the time I reached them, I think it was the next day that I got a call back. It was too late to get any help from my friend. There was one night in particular where he really needed help, where he might have actually left the house and gone and gotten help. And what I learned as I researched it more is that program out in Lancaster called Valley Oasis, in the 80s, they had changed their policy. The director there was named Patricia Overberg, and I have a picture of her. I'll show you. She's now passed away. But in the 80s, she was getting a number of men. And she had like 11 different houses that she called cottages. And she decided, look, these men have no place to go. Many of them coming from Los Angeles, willing to drive an hour into the desert for shelter. And she'd say, okay, she told her staff, okay, from now on we're taking men. And she set aside one of her cottages for male victims. And it took some adjusting, of course, but they never had a problem with it. If there was overflow from, say, too many men or too many women, they would ask the shelters. They would ask one of the shelters, do you mind, for instance, a women's shelter, do you mind if we have a male victim in here? And they never had problems doing that, from what I'm told. Obviously, there may be issues with mixing them in general without consent, but if they're small shelters. But that was something that I learned that they did. And what I also learned from them, directly from Patricia, was that when they made this policy, they were mistreated by a certain number of other shelters in the LA County area because they did that. When she would show up to the LA County Domestic Violence Council meetings, she would be ostracized. She would be, when she would speak up about battered men and the need to help them, her comments wouldn't go into the minutes. Things like that. She wrote me a whole declaration that's still online that you can read, and it's quite amazing the way they treated her. But she stood by it. She stood with it, and over time, more and more people started understanding and accepting it. And in fact, it wasn't all the shelters who did that. It was a small number, but they had tremendous influence on the others, and it became a political issue. And when I learned that, I was a law student. I didn't know anything about these things, and I became more and more angry the more I learned. More because I'm finding that this isn't just an issue with my friend, and because she's telling me how they have men all the time coming up, and that's same-sex men who are victims of same-sex violence as well as opposite sex. It didn't matter. And what often was the case was like my friend. He's a lot bigger than her, but he's not going to hit her, especially not with the kids around. And he needed to get out and take somewhere to take the kids so that they're not witnessing it. Because as I'm sure all of you know now, they've shown that when kids witness it, it becomes a cycle. It's an intergenerational cycle. It increases their chances of either seeking out those kind of partners or being that way themselves. That's not to say they're all that way. It's just an intergenerational cycle. And I started researching, is this just something happening in LA County? I started looking online for groups that addressed this kind of thing, and I only found two. I found a group called SAFE, which stands for Stop Abuse for Everyone, a nonprofit. And I found the National Coalition for Men, which back then was called National Coalition of Free Men. And they had been founded in the 70s. I joined both of them, but they were both not very strong. They were all volunteers. They had no real budget. They had no government funding or anything like that. And I didn't even know any of the members in the LA area. It was mostly online. But I joined them anyway because I thought someone has to do something. And the more I researched it, the more I found this is nowhere near the small problem that we're being told. Today we may hear a little more about it. But this was 20 years ago, when talking about it even in my law school class would trigger reactions that weren't very good. Or else they thought it was always only same-sex men or always men who were just very wimpy or something like that. It was the stereotypes and the misinformation was just layered. And so when I started researching it, I found most of the time that when we hear the statistics, back then it was always 95% of it is male and female is what we would hear, or 90%. You don't hear that as much anymore, but sometimes you still do. Back then it was all the time that's what you heard in the media. And that was, I didn't find any credible source saying that it was 95% at all, unless it was coming from a shelter, which of course men aren't going to them. When they call the hotlines, they're told it doesn't help them, so they don't even get there at all. But the 90% and 85% figures were coming from crime data, crime reports, either crime reports or crime surveys done by the Department of Justice. The Department of Justice does do surveys called the National Crime Victimization Survey. But one problem with them is that since they're a crime agency, the language they use in their surveys is crime-based. So they'll use terms like assault, crime, victimized, things like that. And when you compare that to the randomized surveys that are not crime-based, you see a huge difference in the number of both male and female victims, but especially male victims. It increases because, I believe, and many experts are saying, that it's because men are less likely to even see it as a crime because they haven't been taught that it's a crime when their partner hits them, especially if their partner is female. And it also had have to do with the severity as well. But that's what we're seeing when we look. Back then, I'm going to show you the slide from the CDC, Centers for Disease Control. But back then, there were no federal statistics on male victims except from the Department of Justice. So that was one of the issues that we were constantly hearing was the only federal stats we have show that it's like 85% male and female. Now that really shouldn't mean we exclude the minority anyway. I don't see how that would justify excluding anybody, even if it was one male victim. We don't exclude them. But that was the justification being used. Today, we do have the Centers for Disease Control study that came out a few years ago. And there's the link to it. And that's not a crime agency. No, it's the Centers for Disease Control. So their surveys were not so much crime-based. And it came out much more equal. More than 1 in 3 women and more than 1 in 4 men in the U.S. have experienced rape, physical violence, and or stalking by an intimate partner in their lifetime. And when it comes to severe forms of it, it's 1 in 4 women, 1 in 7 men. There may still be some issues with the CDC, but as far as, I don't care whether it's exactly equal or what. This tells us that it's a much, much bigger problem than what we were being told back in the 90s, that it was 90% or 95% male on female. And so, the more I researched it, the more I found what was happening with Wutha Valley Oasis and in LA was happening all over the place. It might have been more severe in LA than other places, but it was happening everywhere that I looked. This problem where the few people who tried to advocate for male victims were being shunned. If you dared to try to open a shelter for men, you were being sabotaged, and you were just having nothing but problems doing it. And that's what was happening for a very long time. Eventually, what did I just do? I think I just turned it off. Sorry. These are some of the other sources that I went to, and I don't want to, maybe afterwards I'll go into this because, like I said, I'm not going to go all into statistics. I'm going to focus on the legal aspect. But Professor Martin Fiebert, who's speaking over there right now, has a bibliography on his Cal State Long Beach website that shows about 300 studies, all of them non-crime-based studies, some of them very large in scale and some of them small, and using various methodologies, just not crime-based, that show men and women are initiating domestic violence at about equal rates. It can vary here and there, but it's around equal rates. It may change when you look at the severity. Men are, on average, causing more physical damage, definitely. But physical damage is not the only thing going on. There's the psychological damage like I watched growing up. And there's the intergenerational cycle that happens when it's even minor violence, like just slapping your partner, and your children see that, and that becomes their model. And I'm willing to bet that a large percentage of the domestic violence we see today came from people who grew up watching one parent even just commit minor violence against the other, slapping, pushing, or anything like that. I don't consider any domestic violence minor because of that, especially if it's in front of the kids. But I'm not going to go too into the statistics. There is a 32-nation study by the University of New Hampshire that went all over the world and found similar results that Martin Fiebert has with his bibliography. Only recently, I think it was about a year ago, did CNN actually do a story that talked about these statistics. I've never seen that happen before. Can't remember the name of the anchor. It wasn't the main guy. It was the other guy. It'll come back to me. But there's the link there, and if you want that, I can bring this back afterwards. But I'm going to move on from the statistics. Another thing I found was that this wasn't just a problem with the way the shelters were handling things. I had to actually research the law. It wasn't just what was going on at the local levels. There was actually a state law, and this is it, Health and Safety Code 124250, that actually defined, it provided about $20 million a year for domestic violence shelters throughout the state of California. But it defined domestic violence so only women were victims. And that's the statute right there. That's the way it was back then. And I took the New York Consolidated Statutes to compare, because in my lawsuit, I use this to show there is an alternative. Under equal protection analysis, you need to show there's an alternative, and that's what I did. So I'm just using this as a comparison to see this is actually very gender neutral, using terms like person, or gender inclusive, using terms like him or her, his or her. I prefer gender inclusive because it's actually sending the message that there are male victims, rather than just saying person or victim. But either way, it's not discriminatory. And when I found this, that's when I really was blown away. I mean, it was one thing to find that there's bias going on at the local levels. It's another thing to find at the state level they've actually written a law that says something like this, even with our equal protection clause, both in the federal and state governments. And not only that, but this has been sitting like this for decades with nobody doing anything about it. Nobody that I saw, not the ACLU, not the left-wing groups or right-wing groups or anybody speaking up or doing anything. Now, one group did try to do something, and I'll talk about that when I talk about my lawsuit. While my lawsuit was pending, a gay rights group tried to change this, but it got changed back. So this is where once I finished law school, I decided I wanted to do something about this. But I didn't know how, really. I had never filed a lawsuit. My first job out of law school was doing mental health law for a nonprofit where we didn't litigate. I helped people with mental disabilities, giving them free legal services, usually helping them with their Medi-Cal or state hearings or things like that, but not something like this, not a litigation. I didn't know how. So it took me years to even figure that out, how to do it. And then I needed a male victim. What I did first was I formed the Los Angeles chapter of the National Coalition of Free Men, which now is called National Coalition for Men. I got their local memberships. I formed a meeting. I got a group of them together. There was about 15 of them. And from there, of course, I found a few male victims. The problem was those male victims weren't willing to put their name out in the media and, suing anybody. It was something that they didn't want to do. That was one of the main problems that I had. So it really took years and years. Even though I graduated law school in 2005, I didn't actually file the lawsuit until around 2000. I'm sorry, I got out of law school in the year 2000. I didn't file this until 2005. It took years for me just to, Eventually I learned to litigate. I changed jobs, and I found people. But we tried several angles. I first